All right, so welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have this panel here. We have Ed Knapp, he's the CTO of American Tower. Kalina Nikolova, she's the VP of Strategy and Operations at Verizon Media, which you can sort of think of as AOL and Yahoo, although they own other assets as well. Claus Jensen, he's the Chief Digital Officer, Chief Technology Officer of Memorial Sloan Kettering. Tess Caputo, she's the Head of Corporate Strategy of Zoetis, which was the animal health division of Pfizer, which spun out, so animal health. And then Linda Hill, she is a professor at Harvard Business School focusing on innovation, also the author of Collective Genius, and been doing a lot of work recently on understanding ecosystems and ecosystem competition. We don't have as much time as their insights and experience are worthy. So let me just jump right in. And let's start with you, Tess. If you could just tell us a little bit about, do you think that ecosystems are becoming a new basis of competition, and maybe give us a few examples of ecosystems in your world?
Yes, Kaihan, absolutely. We're definitely seeing that while animal health industry is in the more nascent stages of ecosystem development, we're seeing a lot of ecosystems forming and emerging. And the drivers of this are different across the different segments of animal health. So I can give two different examples. One is really about getting transparency in a fragmented supply chain, and the other is more about integrating data from multiple different sources. And so those parallels could be used in other industries as well.
Could you just bring us a little bit into the world here? So we're talking about like a farm, right? We're talking about land.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we're talking about farmers. We're talking about mostly the experience I'll be talking about today is more in the U.S., but we're talking about cattle ranchers. We're talking about dairy farms. Talking about milking robots. Like there's quite a lot that goes into animal production. So starting with beef, the value chain of beef is highly fragmented, particularly in the U.S. So for example, 3 or 4 different farmers, often located in different states, can own a cow before the beef is packaged and sold to retailers and consumers. So it really changes hands a lot. And now there's this really big pressure from retailers and consumers where they're demanding much more transparency into where their animal came from, how it was treated, what medicine it received. But it's really hard to track that information when an animal changes ownership multiple times in its life. And those exchanges often happen at an auction. And also, when there's issues like food safety outbreaks, it can shut down entire segments of an industry because it's hard to track the end product back to its specific origin. So a big trend we're seeing in beef is a demand for much greater transparency and traceability in the meat. So how are we addressing this? So what we're seeing is that various industry players are partnering with big names in tech, leveraging blockchain to create greater transparency in an individual animal's history. So Kaihan, as we were talking about the other day, much like a Carfax uses a car's VIN to track servicing, oil changes, ownership changes. In the future, we're envisioning a world where an animal will get a unique identifier at birth that'll be entered into the blockchain, and then it'll follow the animal through its life. So anytime that it's treated, anytime that it's sold, it'll get entered into the blockchain and be accessible to various different industry players and regulators. So this will give consumers more information into where the meat came from. It'll aid government agencies when they're managing things like food safety outbreaks. It really will provide a lot more information into where our meat is coming from.
And you have multiple players in the value chain that are entering information into this blockchain-contained database, if you will.
Absolutely. There's producers, there's nutritionists, there's animal health companies. There's a lot of different people who are involved in raising animals and treating animals that will all be contributing to and getting information from the blockchain.
Great, excellent. And this is, and would you say that ecosystems kind of competing or working within ecosystems is evolving into a new thing? Is that kind of the future? And if so, what's changed?
Yes, because we're seeing it in other parts of our business as well. It's not, beef is one example, but there's so many different needs, and there's a need for greater connectivity and integration of data. So as I think we're all experiencing this huge influx of data and multiple data sources. And so maybe giving an example from dairy will help paint the picture there. So unlike beef, where the animal changes hands multiple times, In dairy, dairy cows spend most of their lives on one farm, and they're highly monitored and managed animals. In some cases, highly pampered animals as well. But dairy production today is incredibly data-driven. There's a lot of different factors that impact an animal's productivity and the farmer's profitability. So it's the feed that they eat, the barn conditions and humidity, the animal's health, the genetics. It all impacts the quality and the volume of milk produced. So dairy farmers are very data-driven today, but there's multiple sources of data on the farm. They could have genetic tests for the animals to help understand who they should be breeding. The milking equipment actually is like Internet of Things. The milking equipment generates a lot of data. There's diagnostic tests, there's feeding equipment, on-farm management systems, even animal sensors that are like Fitbits for cows. So there's tons of data, and the integration of that data today is really manual. But when you bring it all together, it can really unlock insights that can improve animal health, welfare, and productivity. So today that data is generated by disparate devices that don't speak to one another, but we're really seeing movements that in the future we're anticipating. They'll be much more integrated on a single platform or a few platforms that will really help farmers make better decisions for their animals.
Got it. Yeah, it does seem like the fact that machines can communicate more efficiently than humans kind of opens up exciting opportunities as we move more kind of information to be digital. And I'm wondering, Linda, maybe could you talk to that? Have you seen what do you think the drivers are of moving us towards ecosystems, since you've been studying this across many sectors?
So what I've been trying to do for the last sort of 10 years is understand how you build organizations that can be agile and can routinely innovate. And about 5 years ago, became much more serious about understanding the role of technology and all of that. But when we stepped back to write what we thought a book about sort of transformation of an organization to be able to be more innovative, what we began to see, it wasn't simply about that organization, that most of the organizations we've been working with have been building out the various partnerships they need to get done what they want to get done. And as the young person who's on my team put it, she said, you know what? The platform, purpose is the platform. So this is our purpose. And this is who we serve. So if this is who we serve, who do we need to partner with to make sure we can deliver value to whom we serve? So that approach is what we've seen. So one of the most exciting opportunities, one of the most exciting examples I've seen of this is ANA, the Japanese airline, was trying to figure out, what to do about their business so to continue what to do about their business and continue to grow. And they had two engineers in their innovation lab who began to work on an idea that they call Avatar In. That is to create a global infrastructure of robots, avatar robots, where in fact we can rent them and get them to do what we need to do wherever we might be. So they began to work on this, the purpose being, why don't we have more democracy in where resources fit in the world? This is a logistics problem. This is a mobility problem. They literally convinced ANA to help them work on this. They've just spun out. Because even though, as some might say, they're cannibalizing themselves, what these young men have decided to do is try to build this infrastructure out so that, in fact, they can teleport us without teleporting the mass, our consciousness, our skills. This may seem way out there, but it isn't. They've already begun to do use cases of this in parts of Japan, COVID, where we can't be present. They're using it, a very simple MVP right now, to test out a way for grandparents to visit their grandchildren, a way for doctors to be able to work in safer ways in hospitals. And their model, though, is in the end, you'll be able to use this kind of approach to actually do work in space. So they also are working with construction companies in Japan to figure out, they want to test out different materials in space. So they have they already have an avatar robot up there on the International Space Station. So what I see is that's probably it seems very far out when I first heard about it, but no, and it's interesting that ANA would do this. And what's the capability that ANA has? Logistics. They understand how to build out global infrastructures. So they're taking that basic capability, partnering with the private sector, with government, because you got to get the regulation right to make sure you deal with privacy, all the data, et cetera, involved in here. In the process, they're working with entrepreneurs, They have an X Prize. They have something they're doing with Davos, et cetera, to bring in the investors. So this constellation really that cuts across the three sectors is what we're seeing in that instance. That's maybe the most extreme. But I can go to many others where companies are saying, okay, if we're really going to serve our customer, then, and we're going to create value, what can we offer? We have this and that, but we don't have all these other pieces of the puzzle. And what I see that is different is that, yes, you have to write out, you know, the IP, get all that right, all the legal parts of it. But going back to the purpose is the platform is if in fact they only want people to come and play who actually have the same notion of what's the purpose, what are we really trying to do for that customer. So I think that the platform as purpose is what we're seeing. And if whatever it is, you bring in who you need to get it done to be competitive.
Fascinating, because I could think, maybe I'm generalizing, but I think kind of in the 1980s, the purpose was capture market share, create value for us, steal share from others. And kind of what I'm hearing also in what Tess is describing here, you have a platform of people, of agents coming together for a greater purpose, which is, you know, making sure that when someone gets sick from drinking milk or eating a piece of meat, that we can very quickly isolate it, right? You know, that would, does anyone else have an example of that in your space?
I think you can ask the question, what's the purpose of a platform? You can say that the platform is the purpose, but in some ways you can also say, what's the purpose of a platform?
Yes.
We all live in an ecosystem. That's undeniable. There's nothing new in that. Every single institution has lived in an ecosystem for as long as we can remember, all the way back to ancient times. That's the human nature. That's the nature of human society. What I think is changing is that in an increasingly digital environment, you're seeing hub and spoke structures in most industries. There's only a few industries that don't have a hub and spoke structure yet. Healthcare is one of them. It's happening fast. Higher education hasn't happened yet, but, you know, COVID-19 just might be the trigger for that too. Mm-hmm. And then there's government. Every other industry out there already has a hub and spoke structure. So not only can you talk about platform being the purpose, which I agree with, that's an interesting angle, but you can also say, what's the purpose of a platform? The purpose of a platform is usually to try to position yourselves as a hub in the larger ecosystem, which is a fascinating question. We could spend hours talking about what does it mean to be a hub in an ecosystem.
Mm. What do you think, Kalina? In media, you know, we kind of you kind of are there's a hub and spoke model. How do you guys think about where you sit there and how much value you capture?
That's right, and really loved how everybody talked about it, because the question of what's the purpose, what's the platform, why something even exists, I mean, that is the heart of the question. Like, why does a company exist? Why does a product exist? This really cuts straight to the very essence of, like, what is strategy? Why are we here? What is the value? And I think that's really the fundamental answer to your question. Like, how do we think about the value of the whole platform, and how much you capture within that platform has to do with what are you solving for, you know, even connecting that to the jobs to be solved idea, right? Or jobs to be done. So what value are we bringing to consumers, to business customers, whatever that is really kind of the fundamental, almost like currency that defines how much you should be capturing. And I want to answer that kind of in maybe in three parts. I want to say, first of all, there's the concept of what creates the most value for customers and for consumers. And what that is typically kind of in strategic thinking, you would say, oh, I need to have a great product. I need to have this core, you know, function that I'm doing for them, et cetera. And what we often don't think about enough is that the core value may be kind of at the center of how we interact and how we have the conversation with consumers or business customers. But really what is also happening around that is the connections that this creates. So this notion of connections is almost like the currency that defines value. And I want to borrow, I actually will allow myself to show you kind of a little graphic from a favorite book from the Content Trap. You know, this notion of connections consumer connections, which, you know, they're called here user connections, or product
maybe
connections.
Maybe hold that
or
up for us for one more second, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Happy to. So almost like in a way, there is a hub and spoke concept here in a way, because it's a hub and spoke from a value perspective. It's like, yes, maybe a product in content or product or whatever is like in the center, but what it creates around it usually actually creates more value. And this is a huge opportunity for companies to expand kind of the thinking of what is really creating value. It's the conversations that consumers are having in a social network. That is the value. It's not just the product of a social network. It's how they talk to each other. It's the concept of, if I have multiple products in a portfolio, it's the interaction between those products and the connections between those products, and maybe even competitors or other ecosystem products, that's creating a better value. That is actually where the core of the value is. And that is often overlooked by companies, and we're often kind of boxed in this notion of, oh, it's my product, this is exactly the value I'm bringing, but it should be a much more expanded concept. And I'm proud to say that, and I'm slightly corporate branded here with Yahoo today, I'm proud to say that, you know, Verizon Media's mission is connect people to their passions. I mean, that's how we think about, you know, the broader sense of creating those connections. And the second part of my answer is, when you think about that, you quickly realize that by doing this, by thinking this way in an ecosystem, we all collectively can actually expand the pie. And other people talked about it earlier, is like, how do we collaborate with others so we can create more value? Ultimately, that leads to the ecosystem creating more value versus what the parts can create. And that is such a revelation, because, you know, the tactics of how you do that are always complex. You know, is this like a competitor, or is this or a partner at the same time? We have so many great partners that are also competitors. But when you step back and think about the fundamental value that you're creating as an ecosystem, it makes so much more sense, because there's more for everyone. We're kind of rising the tide for everyone. And I get really excited about that concept. And my team is like, oh, stop talking about it, because every time I'm like, if you ever think about why are we here, how are we creating value, always go back and think about your customer. What are you doing for them? You're always going to find more answers there. And then you don't need to worry about who you're doing it with. Am I alone in this value chain? Am I going to capture enough value? Worry about growing the value. Don't worry about capturing the value. And that is kind of, I mean, the fundamental cultural and leadership shift that I'm seeing in media, which is fascinating. And anybody who doesn't do that in media or in any other industry will be left behind.
Yeah, I do want to get into that mindset shift. This sounds like a difficult mindset shift to take. But before we go there, I want to just see if Ed might jump in a little bit, because I would think, Ed, you've worked Qualcomm before. Now, when I think of you, I imagine a cell tower in a rural piece of land in Kenya or in New York, and information connecting, and you have been working within ecosystems for decades. So maybe this isn't so new, and maybe we can learn something from what's already been known about ecosystems. Just if you could give us some examples.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kaihan. So I'd like to build obviously a lot on the previous speakers, particularly what maybe Klaus had said, is that we all live in an ecosystem today. And I think, you know, at an industry level, you could be a market participant, or you could be the center of that platform with that purpose that says people are attracted to you. And I think a lot of that is what we're all trying to do as companies. You know, people try to sort of quote unquote platform each other, right? So you're trying to, you know, be the magnet, be the one where you build that value around your ideas and innovations. And I think from my perspective, my role at American Tower, I'm trying to figure that out from what is essentially a real estate company with these distributed assets. So we have, you know, operations in 22 countries around the world. We have over 200,000 pieces of real estate. When I think about that, is that a platform? And then what's the purpose? So in some cases, it's creating digital villages in communities where there isn't connectivity in the past, you know, and we're trying to expand this sort of ability to connect the unconnected. But in a broader sense, we're looking at it as saying, what if it's not just about wireless, but it could be energy storage, or it could be edge computing, or it could be just climate sensors. So when I think about it, I'm saying, how can I innovate to make that real estate a platform for a broader ecosystem? It's hard to do. in that sense. But a lot of times when I think about the industry, and particularly wireless in general, you know, as we're a market participant, the tower company is sort of it's a horizontalized model that became more efficient so that wireless operators can use that to build out their systems faster, so their ecosystems and their customers could benefit from, you know, the coverage and capacity that those assets can enable. And then when I take it more like down to today in terms of what some of the things are that I'm doing, is we're participating in a lot of different ecosystems. When I think about a number of startups over my career, we were trying to create new ecosystems, whether it was the early days of CDMA and Qualcomm, or whether it was another company called Flareon, where we were trying to create every G in wireless. We're up to 5G, is about a decade long. And at each one of those windows, you have new market participants that come in with innovations trying to create ecosystems around their idea. Now, the industry's matured so much now that it's global. And in the case of devices, you have folks like Qualcomm who have an ecosystem around the smartphone and their silicon Snapdragon, and they have a whole software partnership around that, and they've extended that platform into sort of other devices like AR, VR, medical devices, and so forth. So they've been successful in creating that. When I look at what we're doing today on the infrastructure side, you know, you saw the consolidation to a few large OEMs, and now the industry is moving to cloud. So if you think about cloud, you know, native software and hardware, that's breaking up the ecosystem of what was 2 or 3 large global players on the infrastructure side. So a concept called O-RAN is really transformative, and we're a market participant in that, trying to build around that ecosystem that's just budding right now on the infrastructure side. And it's helping lower the cost and change the landscape of the infrastructure side of wireless. Another ancillary to that we're doing in connectivity is in the automotive sector, where we're sitting at the table with the public sector in terms of DOTs, technology companies, automotive companies, trying to figure out what is the ecosystem.
Department of Transportation, DOT.
Yeah, for data for C-V2X, this connected vehicle, smart cities, and let's call it smart intersections. How does that data get out into a cloud environment as an ecosystem? And how do you even build the relationships there that just didn't exist prior to where we are today with connected technology? So there's a number of sort of places where I see us as a participant. The broader piece is, can I build an ecosystem out of real estate, which is a challenging question, but we have all these different digital infrastructure components that can reside on our towers, and we have a global presence. So there's a value there that we're trying to enable at an innovation level. And then we also participate, and I participate a lot in these newer budding ecosystems in the wireless industry that are companies and industry in general trying to change the way they behave and the way they compete.
Yes, fascinating. You know, Claus, what would you say? Because I think this question of like, are you competing or participating? What role are you playing? That's probably something that there's been attention within your space forever. So, like, what would you say?
Healthcare is certainly complicated when it comes to what role you play. And a long time ago, I worked in finance. Finance was much more straightforward. You got big banks, you got small banks. So there's a very clear hub and spoke structure. Everybody understands it's been like that for a long time, but that's because finance got standardized like real early in the industry, and that makes a difference. So there's a fascinating question here that says, so what's the main difference between a traditional strategy and thinking about a who am I question to the lens of ecosystem? And it starts with the observation that traditionally we've thought in terms of supply chains. A supply chain is a hierarchical structure. There are people that are at the bottom of the supply chain or to the far left. There are people that are to the far right of the supply chain. If you're talking about a different kind of collaborative environment, which is what I think a modern ecosystem is, there is no defined structure. And people that are suppliers in one context can be something else in a different context. So now you got to rethink what you're actually talking about. I personally like the idea of thinking in terms of who are hubs, who are spokes, but you can be hubs and spokes for different things. It becomes a much more dynamic question. Now, instead of saying, who are my suppliers, you have to ask 3 questions. Who are my suppliers? 1 question. You still have to ask that question. Who are my amplifiers? You won't find that in the book. I've sort of invented it for internal conversation, but an amplifier is someone that extends your reach or your power or your impact. It's a fascinating concept. If you start asking yourself, who's my amplifier? Usually it was like, I'll do marketing. But in a digital ecosystem, there are amplifiers out there. If you look at all the people that make a fair amount of money in being known on social channels. They're amplifiers. Mm-hmm. They're out there and taking somebody else's product and they're amplifying the impact of that product. That's actually a role. You have to think in terms of who are your amplifiers if you want to be a hub, or even in some cases if you want to be a thriving spoke. And you have to ask yourself, who are the third-party product vendors that I can orchestrate? They're not suppliers, because they've got their own products and they've got their own supply chain and they're delivering the product, but I'm helping them go to market. So in some way I'm their amplifier, but not quite, because I step beyond that and I'm actually orchestrating stuff. Think about Amazon.com. We've all bought something on Amazon, I would assume, right? Or on Walmart. Now, they don't just sell the stuff that they have in their own stock, to sell other people's stuff too. Right? They've got a marketplace. That is an example of orchestrating something that's somebody else's product. It's probably the most obvious one, but there are many others. So now you have different questions. Yep. Do you want to be a hub or do you want to be a spoke? And for what? We talked about earlier, what's your purpose? Well, that's one of the questions in terms of purpose. Another question in terms of purpose is, do I want to own the experience? Or do I want to provide the machinery that powers the experience? Is a different question. And you can actually be successful in both. What are my anchor products? I didn't say what is my core strategic product, because I don't think that's a rich enough nuance in terms of what you have to think about. What are my anchor products? What are my ancillary products? And what are my third-party products that I also bring to market, but I may not actually be the organization that ultimately delivers that product? So very different set of questions if you start looking at product strategy, business strategy, go-to-market strategy, to the lens of an ecosystem. It all starts with accepting the fact that, forget about supply chains. The world is no longer hierarchical. It's a social, dynamically interacting environment, and you have to rethink what your strategy is.
Fascinating. Yeah, you kind of ruined my next question, though. You complicated it, which was, you want to be a hub or a spoke. Tess, we were talking a little bit about that. How do you think about that role in terms of, where do you sit within suppliers, amplifiers, and the other third parties? And
sure, Claus definitely described this, very intricate web, and I think that, maybe just based on where our industry is, we're in a little bit less of that mature state, and so we're coming to. I've worked with companies in the past. I have a consulting background, and some of the things we thought about, when we're in the more nascent stages is, should you be the orchestrator or should you participate in somebody else's ecosystem? And Claus, pointed out you could do both. But there were a few things we considered when making this decision, because being an orchestrator seems really attractive. You have more power. Your position is more defensible. You're better positioned to capture value. But it's a tough thing to pull off. And so, there's times where I've worked with companies in the past, and you have to have this this moment where you really think long and hard about, do I have the right to be the orchestrator, and what does it take to succeed? And there's a few different things you can consider when you're evaluating a decision like this. Is, do you have an existing platform that has significant market share and the ability to scale? Do you have a powerful brand? Are you able to create a superior customer experience that has a compelling offering that appeals to both customers and potential partners who can be these suppliers that Claus talked about, or amplifiers, even better? And are you willing to invest in what it's going to take to run this platform? So while it's appealing and it's the place that everyone wants to start, it may not always be the right strategic move, depending where you are and what your company has to bear and what the other industry participants are doing. So, you can still consider being a contributor on another's platform, and you can gain access to their customer base. You can leverage their brand to grow your sales. And so there are attractive ways to play on others' platforms as well. You don't have to be the orchestrator.
Yeah, and I imagine you can do kind of the logical analysis of what maximizes your achievement towards your goal, if that's value creation or whatever. But still, you've got this mindset barrier. I would think that, as Kalina alluded to, that people just think about, I got to own the data. Right. I got to own the product. I got to own the hub. Linda, I know you've done a lot of kind of looking at mindset. You might talk.
Yeah, I have so many reactions, and I agree. So I would say that one of the things that's been happening, and I think I said this before, but I've been spending a lot of time with digital natives about all of this, and they have a point of view that I think is important for us to think about. So I certainly do think about strategy and value. You know, I'm a business professor, but what they think about is what's the problem we're trying to solve and for whom. So that's the sense of the purpose. So you go back to that, and then you figure out, after you figure that, if you understand that customer, whatever you're trying to do, then you figure out who do you need to bring together to deliver it, and then you figure out where you're going to get value. So many of them describe themselves, I hate to say this, Klaus, but they either call themselves amplifiers, or more often they call themselves catalysts. We want to be the catalyst. And some of them even reject the word ecosystem, and they keep saying, you know, you need to think about social networks. Ecosystem sounds like it's already there. We're creating new things. We're talking about what's new. It's not really new, but you need to be much more proactive in shaping the ecosystem. That's what I think leaders need to do now. They're always, obviously they existed, but they keep telling me, I keep changing the title of the book, that, you know what, this is more, you have to allow for the grassroots, the movement. So what you need to understand is once it's created, it's going to go where it's going to go. And you want to, and how do you think about shaping? I don't know what word to use for it, but I have to say, and these are, you know, serious business people who are building businesses that are going to make a difference. So their mindset is about abundance. It's about, okay, you know what? The customer is going to own the data, not you. So get over it. That's not where the value is going to be. You also need to think about what's the whole end-to-end experience of a customer. And once you begin to think about it that way, you know good and well that your company only plays in one piece of the puzzle, right? Because none of us really do the whole. And so who you bring in are the partners you need to deliver that end-to-end experience that that customer is going to be looking at. And what they want all of us to know is that we're going to own our own data, not you. So how you're going to end up competing and how you're going to think about capturing value, well, you better think about it a little differently. And I think that that mindset shift, it's funny, I've been doing roundtables around the world once a week, literally around the world. And I was with a group of digital natives who, you know, young, they were all, they're young for me because I'm older, but anyway, a person who's running a 700, well, is a senior executive in a 700,000 person company, who describes that the average age of the leader is 31. And on the senior team, they've had to put a 22-year-old who can really help them understand what's going on in their market. And I'm listening to all of this and thinking, okay, right? And they're like, as another one said, they're 20 years ahead in China about how to think mobile and all of this stuff. They have already come up, they're looking at it from a different point of view. Now, obviously we need to think about data, et cetera. But as I listened to all of these stories, and we had about 10 different executives, all, you know, successful in what they're doing, talking about it, it was about, okay, in the end, we're going to have to figure out who we partner with. Sometimes we're going to capture the value. Sometimes someone else is going to capture the value. But really, it's the whole experience. And what we all need to agree about is what is that experience we're trying to provide. So suppliers and vendors may be thought of differently. We might want to write those contracts differently because we need them to be agile. But if they're not winning too, they're not going to want to play. So it really is much more of I'm not the controller of the hub or the spoke. And until we let go of that and understand you don't have control, and we're not going to do this right. So I remember when I wrote a case about eBay, when eBay first existed. And I remember talking to Meg Whitman and saying, she said, well, one of the issues, I'm going to paraphrase her. She said, Linda, what you have to do is, I'm not too worried about competition from one angle. I mean, she worried about competition in lots of different ways, but she said, most companies are not going to be willing to share power with the customer. Companies don't share power with customers. And when we're building out these Beanie Baby communities, these communities and connecting, they have power and they have equal power. So we have to build an organization that has a culture that knows how to share power with a community, because they had communities of collectors. She said, most companies aren't going to share. They're not going to do it. They're not going to build the mindset inside to actually play that way. And that's going to give us that's where our first mover advantage, if we have one, I mean, it is going to kind of come from. But I do think it is about power and the nature of the relationships that you build with these different parties. And it goes back to, and believe me, these executives that I've met in China or anywhere I'm meeting in the world, they expect to make money. I don't want to confuse you, but they do have this idea that you need to think about abundance. You need to think about it going out, it's viral. and as like with the virus, as we're living with right now, guess what? The virus is going to go where the virus is going to go, and you need to figure out, how to contain it. I must confess that I don't know if contain is the right word, but it's guiding, I guess, as it moves through, if you will, the ecosystem. And virus maybe not is the best word for it, because we know they can kill you as well. But I do think there is a different mindset that I'm hearing that they're approaching all of this from, that I do think that the businesses, until we accept that the customer does own the data, we don't own the customer's data. And when we move to understanding that, because we're going to be required either by regulation or customers aren't going to play with us unless they're getting their fair share, then we're not really thinking about the opportunities or the challenges in the way we need to.
Yeah, it's almost like we just need a different paradigm to map out mentally what it's like to participate in the ecosystems and industries, whatever we wouldn't even call them that anymore. Ed, what's been your experience?
Yeah, I would say that, I agree that there's a lot to pack in here in terms of innovation as a starting point. I think everybody has aspirations to want to be the hub or to have that data repository, because this is a world of, let's say, AI and ML, where predictive analytics and decision making is really where a lot of the value is being created. But to Linda's point, how do you share that in a way that says this is something that's more complicated than all roads lead to one, particular entity that can be the platform for all? We see that with the, sort of the current environment today, where there's a number of companies that dominate in that data collection, and they become really integral in a lot of parts of decision making in our lives. And then when you look at newer businesses and innovation, particularly in the world that I'm living in terms of digital infrastructure, we're trying to enable the sensors and the data that can help Tess's business in terms of IoT devices that can be in agriculture, or for that matter, the types of media that Kalina's trying to distribute. We're saying, okay, we're an enabler of that. But then on the back end, where we're working in certain ecosystems that are trying to figure out, like in France, we have a project called Paris to Connect. And it's really back to this automotive infrastructure, and GDPR is a fundamental construct. So who owns the sort of personal identifiable information as you walk across the street and you have face recognition and a camera, or you try to classify the number of pets or bicycles that move through an intersection, and the ecosystem wants to build insurance or other types of retail location decisions around the proximate data that's being collected at that intersection. Where does that go and who owns it? And so that's a really deep debate, both between the city of Paris, the country at France at the highest level, between the road infrastructure and the privacy requirements of the pedestrians and citizens of the country. So we're at that point now where there's data in public environments where you're collecting this data. Who owns it, and how does the ecosystem build on that so you're creating more efficiency, a better quality of life? And so we're at the intersection of that, because the infrastructure is trying to enable that, but it doesn't move forward without those policies being put in place. And they cut across a lot of different aspects of society. It's not just about one company coming in and trying to be the platform, like in the early days of social media, where that was fair game as far as new platforms being established before, let's say, the network effect took place. So I think it's something we need to think deeply about as a society, and figure out who owns this data, how does it get allocated, and how does it get managed? And it's broader than all roads lead to one hub at this point.
Yeah. And so I guess that comes to kind of the why are we here, kind of why is a city here? Why is a farm system here? What Claus, maybe give us an example from healthcare, because I would kind of think that maybe there is a more natural why are we here in your world.
The traditional answer to why are we here is we're here to help people that are sick. But let me take Memorial Sloan Kettering as an example. If you go ask people around us and say, what is MSK? It's a hospital that treats cancer patients. We have a hospital that treats cancer patients, but Linda talked about what is the real reason that you exist. The real reason we exist and been around since 1884, it started with a hospital, but it didn't start because of a hospital. It starts with the desire to cure cancer. In 1884, the standard of care for cancer was, don't know what it is, don't know how to help you, you're probably contagious, go away. That was the standard of care in 1884. Not a great standard of care for something like cancer. Right? So there's a group of physicians that decided that's not a good answer. They started the hospital because they want to understand the disease. They didn't start the hospital because they wanted to treat people and make money. It makes a difference. If your purpose is to cure cancer, you need a hospital because you have to try out the things that you don't know whether are going to work. And you sort of need to have an environment where you can have practical experience. It is not something that happens in a theoretical world. You got to do everything from basic research to translational research to clinical research, and basically that turns into a standard care. But I talked about research. That's the second leg of the stool. And the third leg of the stool is education. Because the purpose wasn't to treat a number of people, it was to cure cancer, which is a global statement for the entire planet. So if you look at it that way, and that's your purpose. Historically, we were constrained by physical constraints. The only way we could touch people was by educating people in person. It was by treating people in person. It was by doing research in person. Well, guess what? Those constraints just went poof over the last 10 years. You can reach people with treatment advice that don't necessarily come to our facilities. You can teach people, not just professionals, but other people around you, more about cancer. You can even teach a health consumer that if such and such happens, you don't have to be afraid, or if this is your family history, here's some good advice in terms of what you individually should do. It's not care, it's not diagnosis, but still about curing cancer and addressing the needs of the whole human in everything cancer. You get to a different place if you ask the question, what are the things I can now do in a digital ecosystem to cure cancer, rather than how do I make my hospital and my on-premise research better? It's not the same end state that you get to. That's an example of why truly understanding why you exist matters. And it matters more than ever as we get more and more freed from the physical constraints of yesterday.
We are unfortunately going to have to move soon to kind of closing, and I'll ask each of you to kind of share what your main thing that you think that our audience should take away. But there's one question I feel like we haven't really addressed would be, you know, we have that big common purpose, but we also have a more selfish purpose, which might be, you know, value creation, profit generation. And so the question is like, how much do you get to capture? And I'm kind of thinking about the pushback here in the United States we're getting on Instacart and Uber for charging drivers too much, and the other participants on the platform are not making enough. But there is almost like I don't know if it's a social or economic correction mechanism that will determine how much of that value creation is fair or sustainable for you to capture. I was wondering if anyone had a thought on at least how you think about that.
Just one piece of it that comes to mind is that even going back to the data and where it's going to sit, I think the issue is when you think about it is you have to earn the right as a company to have that customer data. And this goes back to trust. And so the connections in the end, because they also can get themselves organized. Obviously, we do have big players that make it a little difficult for you to figure out how to maneuver. But I think that if you think about it, how do we earn the right from our customer or whoever it is, the citizens of Paris, to actually have their data and run the models on it? Well, you earn the right, or if you're in a hospital setting, you earn the right because I think that the solutions you're going to come up with are going to be meaningful to me or people that I care about. So I think, again, when you step back and do that, and if people earn the right, I think we're willing to pay, right, for whatever that might be. So I don't think it's selfish, because I do believe that, you know, the private sector needs to, this is where we really understand that unless we deal with government and maybe civil society to really get at how we think about what are, I guess I'll call them ethical dilemmas in some ways about, or what's best for society. So, and when we all, I think here, believe in capitalism, I think that that's what we're struggling with a bit, that we need to sort of figure that out. But if you're trying to earn the right, earn the trust, and when you do, then people, I mean, I don't know about you all, I'm sort of willing to pay people, right, for whatever it is that they're actually providing me. But if you haven't earned it, then no. You know, it's about how you use your power, I think, as an organization in the end, about whether people are going to want to play with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mrs. Fat, I wish we had more time to dig in deeper, because this is going from, data and technology down to kind of fundamental purpose of humans collaborating. So many layers. But I think we're going to have to close. So I'm going to ask each of you to think about what would be the key lesson, takeaway, insight that you would like the viewers here to walk away with. And I'll ask Kalina to go first.
Absolutely. And what I want to say connects so well with what you just said, Linda. Like, you have to win the right, you have to win the trust. I mean, I'm in a digital media company. Data is all we talk about every day. And the trust is table stakes. You absolutely have to earn the trust in terms of the security of the data, the transparency of how you're using it. But even more fundamentally, keep peeling the onion a little bit, and that gets to my takeaway as well. It comes back to trust, but also value exchange. Like, why would they give us that data? We also have to win the right of using that data for something that makes their life better. Fundamentally, it comes back to that. So building that value in the ecosystem, earning the trust, earning the right to be part of the ecosystem. And ultimately, to that question of hub and spoke, I actually think it's always a portfolio, because what Linda said, it's like, it's going to go wherever it's going to go. Like, you can't necessarily control in a way the entire ecosystem. So really, in reality, what's going to happen, you're going to have all these roles at the same time. You're going to be hub in a certain context, you're going to be the spokes in other contexts, etc. So ultimately, it is the trust, and it is the value that you're building and bringing in that ecosystem that win you the right to capture whatever you need to capture. That is the major takeaway and mindset change.
Got it. Awesome. How about you, Tess?
One of the things that we've had to change our mindset is really about how we think about our industry. And where before we had competitors, and there were service providers, and there were suppliers, now we think of it more like industry participants. And how do we all work together to help serve the customer need? And so changing that mindset shift is even changes the way we talk about the different people in our industry and different companies in the industry and how we interact together.
Awesome. Klaus?
Internalize that transformation is a journey, not a destination. You don't know where you're going to end up, and it actually never ends. You get to one place, then there's always something next. Linda talked about earning the right. I'd say be bold in vision, but humble in execution, because you haven't earned that right yet. It's a journey.
Great. Ed?
Yeah, I would say that this is a complex space in terms of what you think in terms of ecosystem as a participant, and ecosystem as someone you can aspire to be the hub in the types of ways and qualities that was just discussed. So I think it's a strategic question for anyone who's trying to build new businesses or even manage in the current environment as it's adapting and changing. What value do you bring? Are you really a participant, or do you have enough innovation and value to become the hub? And then what do you need to give up to sustain that hub and become the sort of orchestrator, if you will, of that new value creation? I think that's a tough decision to make, depending on whether you have enough innovative value, especially if it's a new market. I think you have some opportunities there, but if it's existing, it's really hard to do. And I appreciate the panelists, and I thought this was a fantastic discussion, so thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ed. And Linda, would you mind closing for us?
I very much appreciate what everyone has said as well. So I always move from the macro to the micro, or I guess I start macro and end up, what do you as an individual leader need to do? If your intention is to do what we've just heard, how do you need to change your mindset and your behavior to actually let the organization know that this is what you want them to do? Because it is a transformation, and you're going to go 2 steps forward and 1 back, because you're going to go back to value creation, as opposed to, okay, how are we earning the right? What's the customer need? Whatever it might be. But it does start with the leadership, and people are following, quote, your lead. So pay attention to the messages you're giving them, either explicitly or inadvertently.
Awesome. Well, this conversation certainly has started shifting my mindset, and I'm bubbling with kind of questions and possibilities. So thank you so much for opening up this dialogue for all of us here. And thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you for including me.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Awesome. Great.